For Chope. Former Labour MP Stephen Pound told GB News that sleaze is endemic.
And there are some people who are still trying to justify with this most sort of egregious nonsense, this risible theory that somehow, having being a spokesperson for a hedge fund actually adds lustre to the cluster, actually makes you somehow a better MP. Absolute nonsense.
NHS leaders are calling for social care staff to be given cash bonuses to stop them leaving for other jobs in the winter. They want the government to offer £500 incentives so they don't take Christmas work in hospitality, supermarkets or firms like Amazon. Those working in care homes must now be double vaccinated. The sector already has more than 100,000 vacancies. 9 Insulate Britain demonstrators have admitted breaching High Court injunctions to protest. The High Court has so far issued 5 injunctions banning road-blocking protests on the M25, around Doverport and on major London roads. Those in breach could face a maximum penalty of 2 years in prison or an unlimited fine. The majority of school staff, parents and students believe GCSEs need to be reformed. A poll by the Headmasters and Headmistresses Conference found that more than half say GCSEs require serious reform and 40% believe they need some adjustment. It reported significant concern that both the curriculum and assessment are falling short in serving the needs of young people. Obesity levels among younger children rose significantly after lockdown. That's the latest from the National Childhood Measurement Programme. Official figures show that now almost 1 in 7 children start primary school obese, and more than a quarter are obese by the time they finish primary school. And an original Star Wars poster is among hundreds of iconic film memorabilia going under the hammer. Fans across the world will battle it out to bid for items worth more than £250,000 during a 2-day auction. The Empire Strikes Back concept movie poster by Josh Kirby is expected to sell for up to £8,000. You're right up to date. I'll bring you the very latest headlines in around half an hour. Now let's return to On the Money with Liam.
And coming up on the money today, the average monthly rent across the UK is now almost £1,000, having risen almost 5% in September, compared to the same month in 2020. We'll be discussing what that means for generation rent, the rising numbers of young adults stuck in rented accommodation, unable to afford their own home. Plus, each day On the Money features an in-depth Money Talks interview. Today we're talking to Professor Wade Allison of Oxford University. He's not only a world-class physicist, but also a leading advocate of nuclear energy. An interesting perspective in the aftermath of the COP26 Climate Change Summit. That's later in the show. And as ever, I want your questions, opinions, suggestions. It's your show too, so get in touch. Email us gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet @GBNews. This is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan, and you're on the money. Now, before we get into the meat of the show, let's just bring you up to date with the latest on the situation in Liverpool. GB News understands the terrorist bomber killed when his device exploded in the back of a Liverpool taxi cab was not known to the security services. The bomber died when his device detonated in the vehicle as it pulled up in front of the Liverpool Women's Hospital on Sunday morning, Remembrance Sunday, of course. The 4 men arrested that day and into Monday have now all been released. Well, GB News Home and Security Editor Mark White joins us from Liverpool. Mark, good to see you as ever. Tough story. Talk us through the latest.
Liam, yes, the remains of that car that exploded on Sunday morning are still behind me at the far end of the car park here, just where the roundabout is at the front of the Women's Hospital. It had been pulling in that taxi just at 11 a.m. as the nation paused to remember its war dead. Now, we don't know, the police have not said whether the bomber's intended target was the hospital itself or the memorial service that was taking place not too far from here. But regardless, that bomb either detonated early or was triggered by the bomber because he couldn't get out of the back of the taxi, but it detonated. Luckily not fully detonated, and the driver of the taxi was able to escape. As far as the the components of the bomb are concerned, we're told that it was made up of TATP, the main detonator that would have ignited the primary charge. That detonator did explode, as obviously we saw from the pictures of the vehicle exploding to an extent and then being engulfed in flames, but it would have been far worse had the full charge exploded. This TATP acetone, effectively, you find it in nail varnish and alike, and it is highly unstable, has been used in a number of explosive devices, improvised explosive devices in the past, including most recently by the suicide bomber that blew up that Ariana Grande concert at Manchester Arena in 2017. Now, detectives, Liam, who've been carrying out a very detailed search of the scene here, but also 2 addresses in Liverpool linked to the attacker, have found what we understand is the bomb factory where this device was constructed, and that is clearly very valuable for them because they're able then to see a lot more. The device itself was obviously burnt out in the car behind me, but at the bomb factory they were able to establish the ingredients, components, how perhaps it was assembled, which will be very important in determining where those ingredients were purchased, whether anybody else had a hand in helping construct this device, and crucially, of course, Liam, whether there are any other devices out there still.
Thank you for that, Mark. Mark White, GB News Home and Security Editor. Mark will be bringing you the latest every hour right here on GB News. Now, today we're talking rents, the price we pay to live in someone else's property. Well, it turns out that as the general cost of living goes up, rents are rising too, and fast. The average private sector rent in September was 4.6% higher than in September 2020, rising to £968 per month. That's according to a new study from the property website Zoopla. Rents are up most in the southwest of England, where there was a 9% year-on-year increase. Wales saw an above-average 7.7% September rise. And in the East Midlands, rents were up 6.9% on the same month last year, again above that 4.6% UK-wide average. While London remains the most expensive place to rent in the country, recent rental growth across the capital has been slower than much of the rest of the UK, reflecting the trend among some professional households at least to move in search of more space while working from home for part of the week. But despite London dragging down the UK-wide growth in rents, this 4.6% increase for the country as a whole still amounts to the sharpest annual rent rise since 2008, with rental growth now at a 13-year high. What this new study shows, yet again, is the extent to which the demand for rental property exceeds the supply, with the number of rental properties available now 43% below the 5-year average, according to Zoopla, and they should know. As lockdown restrictions have eased and businesses have reopened, there has been a marked return, among some at least, to living in more built-up areas. And after the lull in rental demand during consecutive lockdowns, students and younger city workers in particular are very much back in the rental market. And with fewer people so far losing their jobs than expected during this pandemic, housing demand is expected to remain strong, with rents continuing to rise next year too. Now, while that's good news for landlords, it's not much fun for generation rent, the massed ranks of young adults, often of family-forming age. Over the last 30 years, the share of UK households renting has risen from around 10 to 20%, with young adults continuing to rent often for many more years than their parents did, as they can't afford to buy. Back in the early 90s, almost 70% of 25 to 34-year-olds were owner-occupiers. Now, it's less than 40%, with well over half of a generation priced out of property ownership at this crucial family-forming age. Today's young adults up to their mid-40s now spend more on housing and are more likely to rent than any generation since the 1930s, as high prices deny home ownership. and the dearth of social housing and other affordable rented accommodation has seen overcrowding and homelessness escalate among countless low-income families too. So that's your on-the-money question today. As rental costs continue to spiral, how do we help Generation Rent? As always here on The Money, in-depth discussions with people who really know their stuff. It's what we do. And I'd like to welcome today's panel. We have Anya Martin, who's director at Priced Out UK, and she's advisor to the London Yimbies. That's Yes in My Backyard. These are organisations that always get a fair hearing here on The Money. We also have property expert Russell Quirk with us, as well as our regular panellist, Victoria Scholar, Head of Investment at Interactive Investor, here with me in the studio. Welcome to you all. Anya, let's start with you. You are part of Priced Out UK. You are part of the YIMBY Alliance. You do want to see more homes available to rent and to buy. You must be pretty upset that yet again rents have gone up and that rental growth is now at a 13-year high.
Yeah, it's really, really not a good situation at the moment, and it's something that the data that has come out today really doesn't surprise me. So for the last few months, my emails have been going wild with people saying that they have been outbid for properties, they have been made homeless. And we kind of think of homelessness as really affecting only people at the very bottom end of the income spectrum. But what I'm seeing is that more and more people who are actually earning and working with decent salaries are now finding themselves homeless or in quite difficult situations with rental arrears and so on.
Russell, we need more houses, we need more homes. When demand exceeds supply to this extent, prices, rents, prices to buy can only go up.
And look, Liam, it's an age-old conversation and an age-old problem, isn't it, that we do need more supply. It doesn't seem that there's anything that the government either can do or maybe want to do in terms of increasing supply of homes, both from a sale point of view and a rental perspective. So look, we will continue, I'm afraid, to have these conversations until something, let's just say, more dynamic is done. In terms of the data, you're now looking at the average rent as a percentage of wages being 40%. Now, that even just in the last 3 years has gone up 37% to 40%. So the trend is that people are paying a greater proportion of their wages on rent, almost than any other time previously. And look, the answer actually is quite simple. Now, it might not be easy, but it is simple. And that is simply to encourage either private investors, institutions, developers, and indeed local authorities and government to build more homes, but not just to build more homes for sale, but institutional build to rent. Now, build to rent is actually a thing now. It's a much greater thing now than it's ever been. And a large proportion of new builds are now dedicated to rental, but nowhere near enough. Whereas in the US, you've got a huge industry that is based around renting. In Germany, for instance, 90% of people rent. And it just doesn't seem like we have the will or indeed the kind of fabric or the infrastructure to be sensible about how to ensure that people can rent from a value for money perspective, but also longer term in terms of making sure that they've got security of tenure too.
Victoria, you're here not only for your financial expertise, but also because you're a lot younger than me. You're a different generation. Does your generation want to rent, as Russell Quirk suggests, or do you want to buy?
Well, I think all of our generation wants to buy, but it's just a question of being priced out. And this is why we're seeing rising rental prices, because the market to buy is so high. The latest Halifax data points to average house prices of £270,000 in the UK. Now, in terms of what we're seeing in the rental market, it's the same dynamics that we've been discussing in the energy market or in the wage market. It's the fact that supply is shorter than demand as we come out of the pandemic. And these are exacerbating broader problems in the housing market that pre-existed COVID.
Anya, what do you think of what Russell said? He's a fair guy, he knows the property market well, but he's saying that your generation, the Yimbies, just get used to renting. You don't need to buy. What do you say to that?
But I think Russell is actually right when he said that one of the solutions to bringing rents down is building more build to rent. So I think we actually need a combination of the two. I guess the situation is you can build a lot of private sale homes. I still can't afford them because I'm still paying, as a renter on average £1,000 a month. For my rent. You can't save under those situations. So actually you would benefit from rents coming down enough to actually reduce your rental costs. That would allow you to save. So basically any supply will support an improvement of housing costs and an improvement of housing situation for renters, whether it is built to rent or whether it is for private sale.
To see rent controls, and is that what the YIMBYs want? Is that what Priced Out UK wants, or do you think they would be counterproductive?
I think there is a very real risk of them being counterproductive. So I'm not ruling them out completely, but we do know that where they have been adopted in other countries, they don't tend to work precisely because they then discourage builders from bringing forward new homes onto the market. So they can work potentially for a short term, for a kind of shock to the market. But if you have them over a longer period, there are these effects that can happen that aren't necessarily desirable. So I would certainly urge government to actually look at the fundamental issues of supply and demand rather than trying to fiddle around with things like that.
I assume you wouldn't want to see rent controls, Russell. I remember rent controls from when I was a kid. Yes, I'm that old. And it tended to make the shortage of rental properties even worse because landlords felt they often couldn't get a decent return because rents were effectively capped.
If there's one way of scaring landlords away from the private rental sector, it's rent caps. It's a lovely posturing thing to do for politicians on the left of the spectrum. Sadiq Khan has talked a lot about rent caps, thankfully not particularly recently. But of course, yes, if your yield as a landlord is going to be capped, if it's going to be reduced, then you're just going to look for another asset class. You're, as an investor, going to go and stick the money into equities or gold or something else. So it's a hideous conception in reality, but of course it's often used as a kind of political football where politicians are concerned, but they simply don't work. And I think every territory, every country that's tried to use them has seen the consequence a few years down the line is that you end up with less stock, more of a shortage, and really horrible unintended consequences.
Hold that thought, Russell. You're watching On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. After the break, we'll keep this discussion going. We've got Anya Martin, Director of Priced Out UK. We've got property expert Russell Quirk. In the studio with me here, Victoria Scholar, Head of Investment at Interactive Investor. We're discussing how can we help Generation Rent as the average rental cost across the UK spirals. Rental growth hitting a 13-year high. Keep your emails coming. We love to hear your thoughts and opinions. We'll be reading out some of your emails later in the show. Stay with us. You're on the money.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello again. Another largely cloudy day out there. A bit of brightness here and there, but most places staying fairly dull. There's some wet weather crossing Scotland. Also pretty windy here as well. The isobars squeezing together close to this little area of low pressure. Further south, high pressure is nearby. There's a week-old weather front. This one, though, is a little more lively, and it is bringing rain, not just to Scotland, actually, but for a time. We're going to see a spell of rain crossing Northern Ireland, but it should peter out through the afternoon. Meanwhile, across Scotland, the rain will continue across western areas. The east may not see much of that rain until late on, but it is very blustery as well. Further south, the winds are light. That old weather front may be providing a bit of drizzle here and there, but generally dry, but fairly dull, but mild, with temperatures again climbing into the teens. Through this evening, we'll see a bit of that rain just trickling into northern England, maybe across parts of Wales before it fizzles out. Lots of showers then coming into Scotland, a few for Northern Ireland, staying blustery here as well. A bit of snow on the tops of the mountains across Scotland. But elsewhere, the skies tend to clear and it turns a bit chilly. Temperatures well down into single figures. But it does make for a brighter day tomorrow, certainly for most of England and Wales. A few showers, certainly early on over northwest England, and showers will keep going through the day across western Scotland. A few for Northern Ireland as well, but many areas here will be dry, and certainly across much of the southern half of the UK, it's a dry, fine day with decent spells of sunshine, a bit of a breeze and a slightly cooler feel, but still these temperatures are pretty close to average for the time of year. Through Wednesday evening, we'll start to see a bit more cloud spilling into Northern Ireland, turning a little bit damp and drizzly, and that rain will push into western Scotland, where it will linger through much of the rest of this week, through Thursday and Friday as well. But elsewhere, staying largely dry through the rest of this week. Lots of cloud around, and again, it's going to turn milder, but perhaps things turning colder through the weekend.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage. I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back. You're watching On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. Today we're talking about the rental market after a new survey showed that the average monthly rent across the UK is now almost £1,000, having risen by almost 5% in September compared to the same month in 2020, with rents rising at their fastest pace for 13 years. I'm still with my brilliant panel. Let's turn to you, Victoria Scholar of Interactive Investor. Now, you are very much a City of London professional. You do own your own home, if I'm allowed to reveal that. But as far as your generation is concerned, you were surprised when I read out some numbers earlier that in my day, 25 to 34-year-olds in the early 90s, almost 70% of them owned a home. Now it's under 40%. That doesn't surprise you, does it?
Yeah, I think it's just been intriguing to see the huge house price inflation that we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years that has enabled a lot of people to buy homes in the previous generation who couldn't necessarily buy a home today. And I think also what's interesting is if you compare the cost of houses to salaries, because it's just not affordable to get on the housing market unless you've got, you know, the bank of mum and dad or some significant savings or some other kind of financial tailwind to support you with your salary alone. It's just not possible. And like your other guest was pointing to, there's the figure that monthly rents now account for nearly 40%
Unbelievable.
of average incomes for a single occupant tenant.
How can you save for a
home? So it's impossible to save. And we've also got another potential headwind on the horizon from higher interest rates from the Bank of England, which is going to make it even harder to save and make the cost of living
harder
crisis.
National insurance contributions, higher household utility bills, higher petrol prices, inflation now coming through at 3, 4, maybe 5%, as we've discussed on the show before. It all makes it much harder to save for a home, right?
Exactly. So, I mean, yeah, like you say, there's so many pressures on households already. So trying to put aside some money to ultimately buy a house just doesn't feel like a priority. And that's part of the reason why we're seeing rents going higher and higher.
Anya, What needs to happen? Russell suggested earlier that the government may not want an increase in the number of houses that will ease the growth of prices to both rent and to buy. He says something more dynamic needs to happen. What do you think needs to happen?
The first thing that we need to do is build more homes, and that is more homes of all types and tenures. So you've already alluded to earlier, the supply of social housing is also very poor, but also, as we've mentioned, the supply of private housing, the supply of rental housing, all of these are extremely poor in this country. There are a lot of barriers to bring them forward that government really will need to address if it's ever going to deal with this long-term issue. And then in the shorter term, we also need to consider things like the welfare system and how well that is providing a safety net for people, because we've already mentioned that the rents have risen by almost 5% over the last year. Benefits are frozen. Housing benefit is frozen. So it's not catching up, and it hasn't been catching up for quite a long time. So essentially, in my view, there are two solutions. There is building more homes, and there is supporting people in the interim until we build more homes.
Russell, we know that the government has given many, many more planning permissions in recent years. There are now over 1 million planning permissions to build over 1 million homes that the builders aren't using. They're sitting on those planning permissions. That is no longer a controversial view. It's a statement of fact. Surely, if big developers were fined if they didn't use planning permissions, or the planning permissions lapsed, they had to sell them to other people or even give them away, then we'd get those big builders who dominate the market building rather than deliberately withholding supply to keep prices ever rising.
So it's true, the number of unfulfilled planning permissions is huge. The number of land plots that the top 10 house builders of the UK land bank is about 700,000 plots right now. And this is the problem with a free market economy that I love and I support. The downside, of course, is that you end up with an output which is at the behest of the shareholders of those 10 big businesses, those big property developers. If it was based on need and social conscience, then of course we would see more houses built, because frankly 90% of the UK is undeveloped. So it's not as if there's a lack of space. The problem is we are at the behest here in terms of that output at shareholders, or the whim of shareholders. What has to happen, Liam, I think, and this is going to sound very socialistic, and I say this as a former Conservative voter. I'm not sure I'm a Conservative voter now with this government, frankly, but anyway, that's a debate for another time. The government need to grab this by the scruff of the neck, and they need to build houses themselves. And I'm not just talking about council houses. I'm talking about the government jumping into the resale market, identifying plots of land that they already own, building houses under their own steam, but doing it where there is need and demand, making a profit from the resale homes, which then subsidises build to rent and social housing. The government need to get their act together, and frankly need to have a housing minister for the first time in history that knows the property market and therefore knows what he's doing.
And you're available, Russell Quirk, the Right Honourable Lord Quirk of GBNews. There he is. Victoria, Russell is a card-carrying capitalist. He, like me, thinks that the housing market is broken. Look, if you've got these enormous price signals, prices soaring to both rent and buy, and yet more supply isn't forthcoming, that's not a free market, is it? That's a broken market.
Well, I think it is a free market, but with issues and problems and distortions. And I think one thing that's exacerbating the shortage of supply is what we're seeing in terms of raw materials. We're seeing rising costs. We're seeing shortages of labour. We're seeing shortages of workers in HGV trucks and all sorts of different commodities. And that's certainly not helping their problem either.
So for you, as the representative of Generation Rent, certainly here in the studio, and you and Anya on the panel, you agree that you want to see more homes built to both rent and to buy, in the hope, not that causes a crash in prices, but that growth gradually evens out so wages can catch up.
Yeah, and I think that price is the best indication of an imbalance between supply and demand. So clearly, demand is sharply outstripping supply, both in terms of ownership of houses and also the rental market, which is why we're seeing record highs for house prices and surging rents as well. So clearly there is this imbalance that massively needs addressing.
Anya, let's give the last word to you briefly. The new housing supremo isn't quite Russell Quirk yet. It's only a matter of time. It's a bloke called Michael Gove. What's your brief message to him?
Gove needs to really be thinking about what the barriers are to building homes in this country. There's plenty of evidence on this. We know that, for instance, some local authorities are extremely unhelpful in terms of releasing land in their areas. We know that there are all sorts of things like height limits and stuff like that, which prevents homes being built where they are most wanted and in the highest demand areas where prices are. But we also know that there are huge political challenges with addressing that problem. So I think Gove is going to have to be very clever about how he works his way around that challenge, but that there is only one solution, and that is increasing the supply of housing.
Well said. Anya Martin of Priced Out UK and the YIMBY Alliance. That stands for Yes in My Backyard. Thanks as ever, Russell Quirk. Great contribution from you. And, of course, friend of the show, Victoria Scholar. Great to have you in the studio, significantly lowering the average age of our in-studio part of the panel. You're watching On the Money with me, Liam Halligan. Coming up, today's Money Talks interview. It's a goodie. It's with Professor Wade Allison, the physics genius pioneering for a nuclear future. But before that, here's your GB News update with Simon Pusey.
Hello, I am Simon Pusey. Here are the latest headlines this hour. Former Yorkshire County cricketer Azim Rafiq says racism in cricket is worse than in society. He's been appearing before MPs to discuss allegations of institutional racism at the club. An earlier investigation by Yorkshire concluded Mr Rafiq was a victim of racial harassment and bullying, but nobody was disciplined. Manchester City footballer Benjamin Mendy has been charged with 2 additional counts of rape. The 27-year-old is now facing 6 counts and 1 of sexual assault, which relate to 4 people over the age of 16. Liverpool MP Kim Johnson says Muslim people in her constituency are facing racial hatred after Sunday's terrorist attack in the city. The 4 men arrested in relation to the taxi explosion have now been released from police custody. The bombing suspect, who died in the blast, has been named as 32-year-old Ahmed Al-Sway Al-Min. The driver, David Perry, survived and has been discharged from hospital. The terrorism threat level in the UK has been increased to severe, meaning an attack is highly likely. French police have evacuated migrants from a makeshift camp near Dunkirk. At least 1,500 people have been living in a makeshift camp there for the past 6 months, hoping to cross to Britain. The French Interior Minister also says that a network of smugglers have been dismantled in the region, with 13 people detained. NHS leaders are calling for social care staff to be given cash bonuses to stop them leaving for other jobs in the winter. They want the government to offer £500 incentives so they don't take work at Christmas in hospitality, supermarkets or firms like Amazon. The sector already has more than 100,000 vacancies. That's it from me. I'll have more on all of today's main stories at the top of the hour.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of 2 wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Welcome back. You're on the money with me, Liam Halligan. Now, hundreds of you have been in touch on the rental rise numbers. Andrew says, over recent years, the government's imposed increased costs onto estate agents, which are then passed on to landlords. This inevitably has to find its way into rents and doesn't represent profiteering. Diane says, why is there so little emphasis put on second home ownership? Here in Devon, so many new builds are sold to second home owners, which leaves little stock for those working locally and also pushes up the house price, making it unaffordable for locals to buy or rent. Love the show, by the way, and that's a very good point, Diane. Terry says, rich people who have wealth sitting in low-interest banks buy up all the property and rent them for a large profit. This pushes property prices up. And Anne says, what's going to happen when the rents are so high that people can't afford to rent at all? The government will spend 3 times as much keeping people in emergency housing via housing benefits. Keep your emails coming. Let us know what you want to be discussed on the show. We're always grateful to hear from you. gbviews@gbnews.uk or tweet @gbnews. And now it's time, here it is, for my daily interview series. It's Money Talks. I'm delighted to be joined today in the studio by Wade Allison, an Emeritus Professor of Physics and Fellow of Keble College, Oxford. Professor Allison has a long and impressive education spanning from Cambridge, where he studied natural sciences, physics and maths, to Minnesota and Oxford, where he read particle physics and returned to teach in this field. He's an expert in radiation safety and nuclear and medical physics. Professor Allison has written multiple books, including Radiation and Reason, which addresses what he sees as misconceptions about radiation and nuclear energy. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Wade Allison, for joining us here in the GB News studio. I think it's the first time we've had a nuclear physicist in the studio. This is a television first. Great to have you with us. Your basic view is that we have to take care with nuclear energy, but we don't need to fear nuclear energy. We can harness it, and it can go a long way towards solving our energy crisis.
Oh, yes. And, I mean, the days were, when I was younger, when there was a choice between fossil fuels and nuclear energy, and some countries chose fossil energy, and other countries, like France, chose nuclear energy. But that choice is not open anymore. We've decided that fossil fuels are not acceptable. Of course, we could go back to before the Industrial Revolution, at which point we gave up the things we now call renewables because they weren't reliable enough.
So France uses about 70% of the electricity France uses is generated by nuclear. Here in the UK, it's about 15% most years. This is weird, isn't it? Because back in the 60s, which I remember, and I'm sure you do, we in the UK were producing more domestic nuclear energy than the whole of the rest of the world put together. Now our nuclear plants, such as they are, many of them are old. They're going to be decommissioned soon. We've got 7 or 8 or 9 or so operational, and most of them are run by EDF, which is owned by the French government. How did we get into this situation where we seem to have lost our domestic nuclear capability and expertise?
Well, I think our politicians and most of the population have lost confidence, and we've got an educational problem. People need to understand that nuclear, it's amazing. It's amazing how safe it is. People talk about the disaster at Fukushima.
This was in Japan in 2011, after the tsunami.
But nobody died from the radiation.
Thousands died, but from the tsunami.
Oh, yes. That's very dangerous. And I've been out there 4 times and talked to the people and the survivors, schoolmasters and local authority people who have contact with people.
So when you appeared on the show a few weeks ago, in the run-up to COP, we were discussing whether a nuclear energy could be part of the solution or a bigger part of the solution for the UK, helping wean us off fossil fuels. And you made the statement, no one's ever died from nuclear radiation. And I wanted to really unpack that statement and explore it with you more. How can you say that?
No, nobody's died of nuclear waste.
Yeah.
Of course, they did die from the fire and blast at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and an extra 1% of them died from cancer and so on that was probably induced by, of course, most of those people have died anyway now, so their medical records are all available, and 100,000 medical records. We've got a fantastic data set. People were frightened that there was going to be a genetic heritage to their children, but medically we found that none of that happens.
And people died in Chernobyl in 1986, of course, the biggest civilian nuclear disaster of all time, and yet that wasn't from nuclear waste, as you say, that was from a reactor melting down, which is a very different thing.
Well, I mean, there were 28 of them died from the radiation, the people who were brave enough to go in there and do something about it, and from helicopters and so on. And then there are statistically probably 15 children who died from thyroid cancer, although that's contested by some people, but that's about the level. And as far as we know, there is no scientific case can be made that anybody else died. Of course, you can make exciting videos about it, which people like to watch, murder stories and ghost stories and things on television, but that doesn't mean to say that they're true.
And you would know, as one of the world's leading theoretical physicists, why have we got into the situation, Professor Allison, where we are so scared of nuclear? Is it because we associate domestic nuclear power with nuclear bombs, with obviously the loss of life at Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and the atomic bombs dropped in the aftermath, as World War II was ending? Is it because we associate it with belligerence? You've written that nuclear phobia is a costly aberration that the world cannot afford. Where did this phobia come from?
Well, it came in the 1950s. We had the Cold War. And one of the weapons in the Cold War was to make not only the other side frightened of your weapons, but also, unfortunately, your own side gets frightened of nuclear weapons. And of course, this has happened with bows and arrows and so on in history. That part of the objective with weapons is to make people frightened. It's a much cheaper way than actually killing them. So this was, fortunately, very successful. Although we won the Cold War, but we're left now with a legacy that people don't understand, and people are being taught by schoolmasters and their parents and so on that there's something frightening about nuclear. And it's amazing how safe it is. As I say, nobody died at Fukushima at all, and even the numbers at Chernobyl were only 40 or 50 altogether. Not a very big accident.
And what would you say to those who would suggest that another reason we've tended to undermine nuclear, certainly in the 70s and into the 80s, that the trade unions in the coal industry were very, very powerful. They didn't want nuclear to come to the fore, or they didn't want it to stay at the fore as it had been in the 60s, because they wanted to retain jobs for their workers. Is that also an issue?
Oh, it's an enormous issue. And the whole of the oil industry, not just the workers, but the owners of the fossil fuel resources and the workers. And then now we have a situation where there's a whole industry, safety industry. Nothing sells like safety. There's a safety industry of protecting people from nuclear radiation. And it's a multi-billion-pound industry. But it shouldn't be there.
We don't hear conversations like this very often on television, do we?
I don't get a chance to say it very often.
Or the radio. How are you... And yet, you know, no one can possibly challenge your authority to speak on this issue, given your astonishing academic credentials. How is this opinion viewed across the academic world, across the scientific community? Is anything that you're saying scientifically controversial? It might be politically and civically controversial. Is it scientifically controversial?
I think the answer to that is no. I'm a founder member of a group on the internet called SARI, scientists for professional scientists for research for radiation information, and we've got people in New Zealand and Australia and all sorts of people who don't have an axe to grind, except that they're worried for the future of the world and their children and their grandchildren.
And you're saying a combination of fear, a hangover from the Cold War, a combination of existing vested interests, not least the fossil fuel industry, plus lazy journalism is the reason why we're not treating nuclear as seriously as we should be when it comes to tackling climate change.
Well, there's another thing, that after the Second World War and in the Cold War, people were, when they're frightened, that nuclear is above your academic pay grade. We didn't learn about that at school. I have to take what other people tell me. It's not very difficult. It's no more difficult than fire, and it's a damn sight safer. So we need to get it back into schools. We need children to be asking about them. And we did not have, that's another matter, we were not allowed a very effective voice at COP.
You mean the nuclear expertise groups like yours, academics?
You were barred from
You were barred from COP?
Yes.
How does that make you feel? You're one of the world's leading experts on atomic physics. How does that make you feel? You've clearly got a huge amount to contribute.
No, I was... My principal concern was to make sure that the young people who are dedicating their lives, have studied nuclear and have decided that this is their way to go. They were doing dances in the street and things like that. They were expressing themselves about the importance of nuclear.
Are you now sensing, you're in a very academic environment. Oxford is a hotbed of, politics and opinion and sort of fashionable social mores and so on. Are you getting any sense, Professor Allison, that the environmental case for nuclear, and I know from my own reading, that's why you're here on the show, there is a strong environmental case for nuclear. Are you getting any sense that that is breaking through into the mainstream of the environmental movement now?
Not enough. Everybody, except young students and people like me, are looking at the possibility of employment and a job. Now, there are no grants, there are no fellowships for showing that things are wrong and that what you need is for medics to understand more about nuclear physics and nuclear physicists to understand more about medicine. That doesn't produce money. So there's a communication problem. Education is terribly segmented into little pressure groups.
Little silos.
That's right. Now, I was lucky enough, about 25 years ago, in Oxford, there was a proposal to expand physics into a fourth year, and I started giving a course on applications of nuclear physics, where it turned into medical physics and imaging and all these fantastic things that you can do with the radiation. And that was very, very popular. But that got me into talking a lot more with doctors and sending the students up to the physics students up to the local hospitals and to see what their what physics, and in particular nuclear physics and radiation, could do for people's health.
Isn't it astonishing how averse we still remain to nuclear power when across the channel, our great rival, the French, we always compare ourselves to the French, and yet they're generating 70% of their electricity from nuclear power and running all of our operational nuclear power stations?
Well, I think that's a 30-year-old picture in the sense that they have been closing nuclear power stations because the Germans didn't like it. And they are on the edge of, and with difficulty, proposing to build nuclear power stations themselves in France. And in some senses, where with Hinkley Point and so on, we're ahead of them and working with them, because these things are all international. I mean, obviously there are problems of collaborating with China, but I think we should be working with Japan and South Korea and other places who've got a lot to contribute.
Well, Professor Allison, here on The Money, we're certainly going to remain open-minded. We're going to keep discussing these things, and we thank you for your work and your expertise and for coming on the show today. Professor Wade Allison of Oxford University. Pleasure to have you here, sir. Just before we finish the show, I'm going to read out just a few more emails, as so many of you have been in touch on housing and those spiralling rental costs. Michael says a very important cause of rent rises is the harsh tax treatment now applied to landlords. Alex says if housing stock is bad now, wait until 2030 when all rental property has to be band C on its energy performance certificate. Many old properties will need huge investment to meet this requirement, so supply of rented homes will shrink even more. And Andy emailed us, gbviews@gbnews.uk, to say house building requires a great deal of labour and materials, and house builders are constrained with a lack of skilled labour due to Brexit and pressure on the supply chains from the pandemic. It's a complex issue. Thanks for all your emails. But as ever here on The Money, we have in-depth discussions with people who really know their stuff. That's all from me now. You've been watching On The Money with me, Liam Halligan. Every weekday at 1 p.m, I bring you your daily dose of economic, business and consumer news. Thanks for joining me today. I'll see you tomorrow at 1 p.m. This is GB News. I'm Liam Halligan, and that was On The Money.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello again. Another largely cloudy day out there. A bit of brightness here and there, but most places staying fairly dull. There's some wet weather crossing Scotland. Also pretty windy here as well. The isobars squeezing together close to this little area of low pressure. Further south, high pressure is nearby. There's a week-old weather front. This one, though, is a little more lively, and it is bringing rain, not just to Scotland, actually, but for a time. We're going to see a spell of rain crossing Northern Ireland, but it should peter out through the afternoon. Meanwhile, across Scotland, the rain will continue across western areas. The east may not see much of that rain until late on, but it is very blustery as well. Further south, the winds are light. That old weather front may be providing a bit of drizzle here and there, but generally dry, but fairly dull, but mild, with temperatures again climbing into the teens. Through this evening, we'll see a bit of that rain just trickling into northern England, maybe across parts of Wales before it fizzles out. Lots of showers then coming into Scotland, a few for Northern Ireland, staying blustery here as well. A bit of snow on the tops of the mountains across Scotland. But elsewhere, the skies tend to clear and it turns a bit chilly. Temperatures well down into single